Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Reputation Today Primetime on Global Indians. This edition of RT Primetime is presented in association with WordsWork Communications Consulting and Bottomline Language Solutions. Today's session on Global Indians will lay focus on what goes into preparing for and succeeding in an international role. A warm welcome to all our panelists and the 100+ registered participants who have logged in today using Zoom. This session is also being live streamed on our YouTube channel at bit.ly Reputation Today on YT. So if you're facing any problems connecting to Zoom, you can always switch to YouTube without the option of asking any questions, of course. For those who are attending using Zoom, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A box, and the moderator will try to pick as many as she can in the last 15 minutes. Please avoid using the chat box for this. Before I introduce our panelists, let me remind you the hashtag for today is RT Primetime. Please tweet using the hashtag RT Primetime and don't forget to tag our partners, WordsWork Communications and Bottomline Language Solutions, along with Rep Today Mag. I would now like to introduce and welcome our panelists for today. Anubha Prakash, Head of PR for Europe at OnePlus. Thakur, Senior Vice President and Group Business Director at WPP GTB. Lavanya Wadgaonkar, DGM Global Corporate Communications at Nissan Motors Corporation, and Nikhil Kharoo, Head of PR and Partnerships for APAC at Fitbit. And moderating the panel today is Neha Mathur Rastogi, founder at WordsWork Communications. Over to you, Neha, now to steer this conversation ahead.
Thank you, Anubhuti, and a very warm welcome to all of you. And I can very easily say a good evening, a good morning, and a good afternoon to everybody, because I think this might be the first time we have a session at prime time with 5 time zones coming together with Bodhi, Anubha, Lavanya, and Nikhil joining us. Thank you very much to all of you to join us today for this special Global Indians edition of Prime Time. I firstly want to just ask you very briefly, one by one, what is your current role and how did you get there from where you started off your PR career? So if I may ask Lavanya to comment on that first.
Thank you, Neha, and happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to share some glimpses from our journey. I'm currently Division General Manager for Nissan Motor Corporation, heading most of the gamut of communications, including corporate product strategy and employee communications. It's been 8 years in Nissan for me, and I've started my journey in India, moved to Bangkok to head Asia and Oceania region before moving to global. Then the new management took over to take over this role.
Thank you, Lavanya. Nikhil, on to you, please.
Sure. Thank you, Neha, and thank you, Reputation Today team. It's great to be talking to all of you and the other panelists. So I had a PR and partnerships for Fitbit in Asia Pacific, which is across 14 countries in Asia that I look after. I've been working with Fitbit for 5 years now, 2 years on the agency side where I was managing Fitbit for India, and we launched the brand in India before I got this opportunity to move to Singapore. So I'm pretty much responsible for comms, and comms means everything communications for the brand in Asia. And apart from that, I also look out for brand partnerships. Anything to do with brands, collaborating with other brands, or influencers, as it's becoming such an important part of communication business. So I look after that as well. So that's briefly what I do.
Thanks, Nikhil. Anubha, yourself?
Hi, I'm working as Head of PR for the Europe region of OnePlus. In OnePlus, I have spent close to 3 years, actually more than just over 3 years now. But in this role as Europe PR head, I am pretty much a newbie. So just spent 6 months, still learning a lot about the region. But overall in this role, I take care of the entire conceptualization, PR and implementation, implementation of planning in this entire region. That includes, for Europe, like it includes pretty much all the countries in Western Europe, as well as the whole cluster that we call as Central and European Europe. So yeah, that's pretty much my role.
Wonderful. And Bodhi, finally on to you.
Thanks, Neha. So yeah, I am looking after the EV communications for Ford Motor Company as my client. I have been with Ford, and I've been very lucky to get this opportunity with Ford for the past 10 years. I was in China looking after the Asia Pacific communications prior to this, and also in Europe, looking after the product communications on behalf of Ford of Europe with my clients directly. So slightly different role than my esteemed colleagues out here, but nonetheless very exciting. Thanks, Neha.
Excellent. So now that we have the context set, I'd like to start with you, Bodhi, again. You've been on the move a lot, and it's been almost 10 years or more than 10 years that you first moved out of India, and you started with China, moved to Europe, and now you're in US. So can you tell us a bit about how the PR changed from country to country? What were the cultural differences that you have experienced over your journey?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that when I started off, it was dealing with 9 different markets, which went on to become 11 different markets. And Lavanya will know because she's leading Asia, or any of Kharoo, Nikhil as well. But it's culturally, I think every country has its nuances, including India. But the thing is, storytelling is like the creativity behind storytelling remains the same. If you are a creative person, if you are reading, if you are learning across what's happening across the world, there are some storylines that remain the same across the globe, whether stories that involve emotion at the heart of it. So that has remained the same across all the geographies that I have been. But culturally, of course, there have been things very, very different. Like we have done campaigns in Indonesia where you have to be mindful of not doing anything related to, say, for example, pet safety, because that's not a country that people are using pets regularly. Or if you are doing something in China, how do you go towards a localization angle, because that's what matters to that market. Or here in America, where I'm doing campaigns, which is more focused on the US audiences. So it is, the audience differs, but I think the storytelling and the creativity, which I've seen, is the same across the market. It's interesting, when we started off, like one of the things that I was told, like, oh, this will not work in our market. And after a couple of discussions, it's the same campaign that works. So it is how the nuanced the cultural differences can be, but also how easily you can have a campaign work if you can do those localization across the market. So from my experience across Asia and Europe and now America, is that if you have a good story to tell, the story can be told with tweaks in localization.
Great. But Bodhi, how was it, in terms of when you looked at your new roles as you jumped to your different roles, and I'm sure you were competing with the people probably who were local to those markets. So what made that irrelevant and what made it still work for you?
So, I have been very lucky to be associated with a client like Ford Motor Company, who have been very, very, like the thing of diversity runs in that company right from the beginning. So there have been very less opportunities where I've been questioned on what I've been advising the team on or the clients on. Of course, there have been teams who have said that, okay, this would work from a local point of view, and you have to be respectful for that. So I think when you go into a role like this, you have to respect what people tell you, or even people tell you in not a very nice way. You have to still respect that, because you don't know that market. So when I went to London, it's a very creative and very different market than we have elsewhere, even in the US. So some of the campaigns there are more, I won't use the word developed, but more creative and slightly more different than any other market. So even within Europe, we had markets complaining that our campaigns were very UK focused at times, and it happens because you are in that market. But I think you just have to be respectful and listen to people. And I do listen to people who give me great advice. And it's not my agenda versus their agenda, it's our agenda. And the moment you make people rally behind that and you become a part of a team, I think it works.
Thanks, Bodhi. Lavanya, you're in Japan, and I'm sure at some point language does become an issue, or maybe not. I don't know. So, can you talk more about how it works from a language perspective, language barriers? Because us being in communications, that I'm assuming would take center stage somewhere or the other. So, how does it work for you?
Very interesting, because as I was listening to Bodhi, I just wrote down typical PR character about that one sentence I wanted to say. One thing I learned after moving from India, because we are a multilingual country, to Asia, where we were covering more than 32 markets, and now to Japan, where we are sitting headquartered globally in Japan, but dealing with the entire world. There's one thing that I learned is don't judge people based on their language skills. And this is a very, very important lesson for me, because most often we tend to listen to people who speak well. And we tend to be more, I think, lenient towards somebody that we can connect and communicate with. But that's something that I had to unlearn when I worked in Asia and now in Japan. And it applies, I think, beyond Asia as well. Japan is a bilingual country, and mostly I would say predominantly Japanese speaking country, but Nissan is a very global organization. And because of Alliance, we have a mix of French and Japanese and other languages coming in. It is difficult because you have to work in a bilingual environment on a daily basis. So everything that you do, you have to do twice. And you also need to be careful that the language is not literal translation. So as we call it, transcreation, it's more about getting the meaning across. And as Bodhi was talking about storytelling, it's getting the meaning across, not about just translating every sentence by sentence. And that becomes very, very important as you work in multilingual environment.
That's right. Nikhil, what's been your experience in Singapore?
Yeah, I think they've covered most of it, but one thing that I wanted to say, and both of them touched upon it, is that language of great storytelling doesn't matter. So as long as you're able to, for me it's the same, because I manage 14 different countries. 14 countries at different maturity levels, developed markets, developing markets. But what I've realized is that I need to understand what value do I bring to the table on what my local teams bring. So what I try and do is that, the global brand that we have and we guard so closely, is that how do I take that global brand and take that global story and work with the local teams to develop stories that are locally relevant. And when you're working in that manner, the collaboration with the local teams, you're still able to deliver that global story, but you're making it relevant for the audience that is there in the market. So I think that's been my learning, that, as both of them said, language is difficult. It's sometimes difficult to communicate in some markets where they only talk in the local different language. But when you know what the overall story is and what you're bringing to them, and then giving them the freedom and independence to localize that global story, I think that's been the way I've worked with my teams across the markets, and it's worked really well. So that's what I would say.
Perfect, great. Anubha, you have recently moved, and it's been about 6 months since your move, and your India experience is still fresh with you. So is there anything that still works for you, or did that experience teach you a lot for your current role, or what is your fresh perspective on this move that you've recently had now?
Yeah, so I think my India experience was really the building block for this role that I'm into. And as a person, I was always eager, whichever company I worked for in my career, my focus is to always contribute more and look at a broader picture. And it was, for me personally, I was never trying to, or excited to geographically move. But the excitement to do something which is not just about the region that I'm looking at, but how the things impact to the other region. And I think OnePlus was a great opportunity, because being the global brand, we do launches and all pretty much at a global scale. So all the events, all the campaigns that we do, for the last 3 years, I have been trying to learn for myself that how does a campaign, for example, when we hired Robert Downey Jr. as a brand ambassador in India, what would be its impact in the other part of the world? but that's, I mean, it's a big thing. But I would rather take an example of 5G, where as a technology, OnePlus is always ahead to talk about what is our contribution as a handset brand. And I think 5G, we all know different part of the world are in different phases. So I think it gave me a lot of opportunity to see that if the narrative of 5G is convincing enough, even in the countries where 5G is yet to come, there's an opportunity to talk about it. Where 5G is already there, there's definitely an opportunity to talk about it. So I think, as Bodhi and Lavanya and my other colleagues said here, that it's about, when you have a strong story in mind, it's about really then seeing that, like matching it with the local nuances and giving it that local flavor, and then kind of telling it in a local way. But yeah, that's been my experience. And at least in my India role, I have always been learning that, and I'm great that I got this opportunity. So I pretty much still use those same storytelling techniques and making use of my experience from India here.
Perfect, wonderful. Lavanya, you had mentioned that there was a recent global campaign that you had conducted, and that kind of went through across different markets in this whole nuanced way that we're talking about here. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's actually fresh in my mind. We recently launched the second generation EV, Arya, and it's interesting. The name Arya comes from Sanskrit. So it was something very close to my heart because you could immediately identify it. So this was obviously a global campaign, so I don't have to say how many markets, but it was something we were designing, one, in the new norm, which is a digital campaign. There was a big discussion around how to do this premiere earlier than before COVID, and it was all a physical event. There was a lot of planning that went into a physical event, which was supposed to be opened up for every region to come participate with their media. But we changed the entire thing into a the digital world. And then it was a show format. One of the things that we had to be very careful about is the point we touched on, bilingual. So where we were doing the digital, we were also addressing the Japan market, which is the home country, as well as English. So we were doing it in 2 languages simultaneously. That was one big thing. A few things that I would like to talk about when you run a multi-channel, multi-country campaign to multi-stakeholders. So this wasn't a campaign designed only to address media. It was supposed to address all stakeholders. And there were various days that were designed to do that. And what we had to plan out was, and first, let me talk about the result. We had 20,000 hand raisers just based on PR campaign. So this really immediately showed the value of communications as soon as we launched the campaign. The objectives of the campaign is, one, this is the second generation EV being launched after 10 years after the first Nissan Leaf, which is the largest mass market vehicle from Nissan. So there was a gap of 10 years before we had to connect the story. We just recently announced a transformation plan for Nissan. I think most of you might know a little bit of the past 2 years crisis that we were going through. So we just, on May 28th, had the transformation plan announcement. So this was coming immediately after that. That means this becomes one of the key proof points for us globally to rebuild trust, gain reputation. Third was, we were also relaunching our logo. There is a new logo that the car would carry for the first time. So there was the whole excitement about a new face that was being created. So multiple storylines, multiple messaging that needed to go, but all messages were aimed at rebuilding the trust and reputation for Nissan globally. So one of the key things for us is, how do we align and tell the story to each of the region? Because the maturity levels, and I think I think Nikhil was also mentioning about how we deal with multiple maturity levels. And as you know, EV, and Bodhi can just support me, it's not the same everywhere in the world. So the acceptance of EV is at different levels, but the story is trending even in the frontier markets, even in the markets where there's mass vehicle movement. And obviously metro markets are the big ones. But we also have markets where we need to launch this, or we would be launching these vehicles, where we wouldn't be launching the vehicles. So still we needed to make the story relevant to the markets where the vehicle wasn't going to, because it was a global story and the story was carrying more than just the product. So this was important. So what we thought about is a 3-phase launch. We started building towards the world premiere, where we just started teasing out, giving appetite towards the vehicle. It started with Tokyo Motor Show beforehand. So 1 year, there's been a lot of teasing, a lot of anticipation being built across the world for the vehicle. So the world premiere itself was like a big event where what people were anticipating was being delivered. So that kind of excitement needed to match the show level that we created. So everything was different. The way the speeches were written were more from a storytelling point of view. And I think all of us talked about storytelling, so we know how important it is. Storytelling, as all of you said, is timeless and it rises about cultures, but it has to be relevant. It has to be sensible and sensitive. So that was the key. So working with regions, it's about adopting the high-level story to make sense to each of the markets, and then working with the wide range of media base. Because of the multiplicity of the storytelling, we had to look at varied media, not just traditional media and traditional auto media, because they would be anyway excited about it. But there's bringing in all those aspects. So it was a massive planning with the regions. So we are divided into 7 regions across the world. So we had to work with each of the regions to really rewrite the story that is relevant to them. 2 is the new norm makes it very easy, and maybe we'll talk a little bit later about it, but connecting the whole world through Zoom. So we had 1 full day of media roundtables, but it's not just 5 zones that we are using right now. It's like multiple time zones that we had to use, but it made it easier and possible for us to really connect with the world and tell the story. So you can imagine that today I'm talking in 10 minutes to Chinese media with a simultaneous interpretation, going to talk to German media with no interpretation, but a different accent. And so it was amazing. So that was to be considered as well. One of the key things that I would also talk about is the pace with which we do these things. So when we work with multiple regions, and because of the time zones and because of the way they plan their own events, the pace is important. If you set your own pace and you want to follow your own pace, it doesn't work. So it's very important. In Nissan, we have something called PDCA. I think it would be there in most of the countries. It is called plan, do, check, and act. So it's a continuous process of reviewing everything that you're doing, but really checking whether it's going to be working or not and acting on it. So those were the key elements of it. We did end up having a massive positive coverage, almost 99% positive coverage, because everything that we wanted was landed. But the key thing was sound bites and headlines. So when we were writing the story, we were writing in terms of what is that would land on a headline. Some of it was regarding our corporate purpose and the DNA, which we thought media may not carry. It was an important story because we're talking about transformation, but it actually landed up in headlines, even with mainline media, because they started talking about how this is so relevant today. And this is because of the COVID situation, because trust has become so important for all audience that any messages related to trust was really being carried by the media. So those were the elements that were very important for us: pace, message, sensitivity, and sensibility in running a campaign. I would just summarize it with that.
Perfect. So Lavanya, what I hear from you is that, there has to be a really strong message, and that kind of goes through across different markets. But Nikhil, tell me, do you think the message sometimes could get lost in translation, or how do you keep it relevant given that different markets have a slightly different way of consuming that same story that you're trying to tell?
Yeah, I think for me, I think we sometimes lay a lot more emphasis on message. I would, I would be a devil's advocate to that, and I would say that sometimes we need to just look at things unconventionally and see what we can do. I'll give you a quick example. As a brand, because we are a product-driven company, so we let our products do a lot of talking, and we suddenly realized that in Asia we don't talk too much beyond our product. So what do we do? And we came up with this term that we want to be part of popular culture. And now it's a very easy term to say popular culture, but popular culture is not the same what it is in India, what it is and it's not going to be the same in Singapore or Japan or Philippines or Australia. So we said, okay, so what can we do? And how can we make popular culture talk about our brand? So what we looked at was, okay, let's define popular culture in each country. And the best part about it was India was the place where we started it and became a best practice, which we took to every other place. So we said, okay, Bollywood and cricket is the popular culture in India. So we said, so how can we get our products across in a way that people can see the product at, on a cricketer's wrist? We don't talk and still the brand is talking, right? So what we looked at, also the thing was that, you can't afford cricket in India because it's so expensive. You can't afford a Virat Kohli's wrist, right? So it's going to cost you millions of dollars. So we said, okay, so what can we do? So what we looked at was, what does our brand stand for? And we realized and we knew that our brand has credibility and our brand is synonymous with wearables and wearables which help people to know their health better. So what we looked at was, how can we do it slightly differently? So we set up these meetings with trainers of teams, sports teams. So we set up a meeting with the trainer of the Indian cricket team and told him what our brand can do. So what the devices can do, and it can help you. And we didn't lay any expectations. We didn't say that we want anything in return. And we said, okay, can we help you? So it was more about, as a brand, we are experts in doing what we do. You are an expert in what you do, but can we collaborate on our synergies? So, and it really clicked. And he said, okay, yeah, I want to know what the players are up to. I want to know how they're tracking their physical health. So, and we seeded products to the Indian cricket team. There was a World Cup which was coming up, the T20 World Cup. We had blue products on their wrists. Everybody in the team, from MS Dhoni to Virat Kohli to Hardik Pandyas of the world, they were wearing it while they were playing. And, we could tell our story without really being in the story. So I think that sometimes is important. And as I said, for us, like as a brand like Fitbit, brand awareness is not an issue for us because people know our brand. So for us, sometimes it's just being out there where people can see we are becoming part of popular culture. Similarly, we did with Bollywood. We were in the movies without really paying for the movie. So, a lot of my friends who manage celebrities or who manage Bollywood say, this is not good for their business, but yeah, we were able to do that. And then once we were able to do it in a market like India, we actually replicated it across Asia. So by the end of it, as a brand, we take immense pride of the risks that we have made our ways without actually paying them. And we had in Singapore, the only guy who won an Olympic medal for them, we had that guy wearing Fitbit. We had Barack Obama at that time being president wearing a Fitbit. We had Shaquille O'Neal, Jennifer Aniston. So I can name celebrities, and it was the same route that we took. So that's why I said sometimes we need to move beyond the conventions they are important, of course. That's the base on which the brand is built. When I say message, storytelling, that's all that we've learned over the years. But sometimes I think it's important for us to, especially the way things have changed and the way the storytelling has changed, looking at different platforms, looking at you not being in the story when the brand is still out there. So I think it becomes important for you to experiment, and it becomes important for you to sometimes take those risks and see how the brand can flourish even when you're just in the background. So I think that's the point I would actually make there.
Right. Just to rewind a bit as to where you started, and of course again coming back to where you are, Bodhi, did you always plan to have an international career once you got into PR? Was this a planned move or did it just happen? And how did it happen?
So I think my mom had to do a lot behind this, because when I started off, I was like, oh, it's good. I'm in Gurgaon, I'm in Delhi, I like this place. We were in a happy place. And I put it up on my LinkedIn, and I was taking an evening walk with my mom, and she was like, aren't you getting complacent? And I was like, no, I'm kind of happy. And she's like, no, you are not ambitious. You need to think bigger. And and that's where it started. And I think once my wife came into the picture, it just quadrupled. So I think uh, that's what wives are for, right? So I think that's the fire to do something bigger. And I'm not saying like people, if you live in India, you are not doing anything big. I think like Neha, you are an ideal example of who has made an amazing career out of like what you're doing and being an entrepreneur. So you are like an inspiration to many. But I think what happens when you look at an international career is that your horizons broaden personally. So even leave aside professionally, the fact that you go out and you have to make something credible for yourself and have your voice heard, because I think that's there is a lot of discussions on diversity and everything happening. I think it is, and I think most all of my peers here must have faced at some point or the other, is that your voice heard across um, a very international colleague. Because if you have a colleague coming from America to China or India, they will be like, oh, there will be no problem. You would be able to give a lot of learning to the teams, whereas vice versa, it would be like, oh, you're not from the developed market. Like, would you be able to fit in? So those questions have come in. So I think it was a challenge, but I always wanted to accept the challenge and do something bigger and better. And as I said, like luck plays a major part in all of this. You have to be at the right place at the right time. And it just happened, and things fell into place, and I moved along, and God's grace and my mom's blessing.
Brilliant. Anubha, recently, I mean, ever since you've shifted, I mean, everyone talks about how great it is, but I also wanted to touch upon the kind of challenges that might be there. It all sounds very rosy, you know, when you look at it from the other side. And I'm sure a lot of our participants here aspire to be where you all are today, but I'm very sure that it couldn't have been easy as well. And there are challenges that come your way when you take up global roles coming from an Indian role. So, anything that you can share in that light?
I think from the time I've been here, I never expected when I landed here in January that the world will get into this situation. So I couldn't have been prepared for this. I was all my entire of the last November, December, I was excited for this role. I was looking forward. And you know that in our role, face-to-face interaction matters so much. And I was coming to a role where I was required to travel to all markets, France, Italy, all market, talk to the agency, talk to the PR person, understand. But then I was just left in a lockdown period where everybody, where I couldn't. So it kept on. I remember that since Feb, I was delaying my plan to meet them, thinking that we will overcome this, but things became worse. And then today we are sitting where now it has become like a part of our life to be talking to people on Zoom. But I don't know how would it be, frankly, when I would have come in a normal situation where I would have met my team in person. But I'm still trying my best to have the same sort of interaction with them, tell them how I'm looking to, because it's important, of course, everybody will understand here to align with your team, especially when there are so many cultural differences within Europe. But I think more than anything, it takes a lot of sort of self-discipline. And as a citizen, we talk about self-governance. But I think as a professional, it took a lot of it was not easy in the beginning to be spending hours and hours on Zoom call where you have never met that person. The person just got to know that now you will be managing, but exactly who are you? What do you bring to the table? So I felt a gap in the beginning, but yes, over time, I think it's been 3 months and it almost feels very normal now to be talking to all my team members. There's a fixed one-on-one schedule, and we talk to them as much over a video call than a voice call. And we all lead by example, because it's easy to just talk over a voice, but to get the same attention it's sometimes difficult. So we try to get as close to a personal interaction as we can, and thanks to a platform like Zoom for that. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey.
That's interesting. And another thing I've always wondered about, and I'd like any of you to answer this, is how media is different in different markets. And there are certain practices which are extremely local, and I really like to hear about these things, whether it's a China or a Japan. So is there anything any of you can share which is completely locally nuanced, which maybe none of us have ever even heard of before?
I think there's one thing that I can start, and probably my other friends can join, that recently we launched Nod, which is a smartphone, new sort of line of smartphone within OnePlus, and learning from that. And, you know, as I said, in OnePlus, we always work on global campaign because as a company, we work on a product, video or things like that, which is going to every region. But one thing that what was new to us is that in Nod, we basically used a series of documentary to talk about the behind the scenes story of Nod, how the company kind of conceptualized this phone, why we are bringing it to the market. One of the interesting take within Europe that I learned is that while that behind the scene documentary was taken very well in some parts like Denmark, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, they were very happy that OnePlus is giving us so much insight behind what goes behind making of a phone. But in a market like France, media were like, why are you showing that there is so much pressure within the company? Is there no work-life balance? What are you trying to show? So the cultural thing of France being very vocal in terms of the work-life balance and the professional sort of, you know, personal time and things like that, that kind of reflected, and the way they reacted. So we had to give them context that no, we are talking about a tense situation. It's a period of when you face, any company face, does not matter from which background, whether it is from Korea or China, but it is about what is the pressure that goes behind delivering a phone to the market. But yeah, it was very interesting for us to learn this sort of reaction.
Absolutely. Any other such experience?
But I would say, well, at the end of the day, one thing we need to be clear that every media is thinking from their audience perspective. So they have to deliver to their audience. So it's very important to understand who they are catering to, and market levels that we're looking at. But there are certain practices which do stand out very clearly. If you look at it because I'm here in Japan, I can say it is still a very traditional print-based media. So they have a very traditional way of working. The way you meet them, the way you pitch the story, or the way the stories are written are very, very traditional, which could be very different if you are elsewhere. So, for example, if I take Thai media, you don't really engage much on discussing the topic. It's more on relations. So if you really know them well, you talk to them well, I think the story sells well. It's not like they'll take anything that you give them, but relationships are more important for them than just people being transactional on story level. So this is very critical. Take Australian media. We tend to think, I won't generalize, we do tend to think they're very aggressive. They tend to be aggressive because they're looking for their story and they want to get their story at any cost. Very similar to UK media, Anubha, you can correct me, but I do find very similar approaches between Australian media and UK media. To a large extent, people think Indian media are aggressive because they ask a lot of questions. When we dealt forever with Indian media, we don't find them aggressive because I think they're built like us. So it's more about the cultural differences and the way it's spoken. Like, for example, if I'm talking in Vietnam, I talk at a pace that Vietnam media will never understand. So I have to really slow down to be able to get to that level. But we naturally, when we are talking, all of us being Indian origin, I think we have a set way of talking and we are very fast, but it doesn't really work that way. So Chinese media, completely different. So some of the things, like if you are doing a media roundtable, you ask Chinese media to give questions in advance, they're willing to do that. They will provide the questions in advance for you to be able to prepare your executive. But it won't be the case if I'm dealing with American media, because they would get offended if I'm asking questions in advance. For them, it's like, let me first listen to what he's saying, because my questions will be based on what they're delivering. So I think, yes, media, the way they differ, the way that we pitch is different, But like I said, at the end of the day, they all are thinking from their news point of view, from their audience point of view, most importantly, from their editor point of view, because their news needs to be published as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's in a way a reflection of the local culture also, in terms of how the media operates across different countries. But, this year being a completely different year altogether, and I think all countries in the world have a different way of dealing with the ongoing pandemic. And I know I'm not getting into the pandemic itself, but purely from a PR perspective, just to get best practices from all of you in terms of how things have shaped up this year and how PR has changed, or what's that one positive change perhaps that's happened in PR during this time, that things have changed so drastically. So Bodhi, would you like to start there?
Yeah, sure. Like you said, like it's been some time now, but I think the biggest opportunity for us PR folks is, I think, the connection that we have been still be able to make across the organization while we have not been in office. So one of the things, like we have just launched an electric vehicle, Mustang Mach-E, and one of the things we were like, the tempo will go down if we don't start telling some stories. So we started doing stories about how engineers are working from home during this pandemic, and what kind of technologies that they're using at home. And the media love this kind of story because they are looking at those human interest stories. It's not the core that the media, and we are talking about the media just now, is that media do not want the same old technical details. You have to give a fresh perspective. And I think that one worked great from our point of view. And I think also the recognition that you can work from home with kids, without kids, with the biggest distraction, the fact that you can still reveal vehicles, you can launch things, you can do everything. I think that there is a recognition across our teams that things can be possible. And one of the things that I think everybody has learned, that people have leaned heavily on communications or public relations, because there are no advertising budgets, there are no paid budget anywhere. So everywhere it's the heavy reliance on storytelling, and the only people who can do storytelling is us, because we know what clicks during a story. And you do not, like, we made an effort to not do any product storytelling for 3 months, because you do not want to come across as tone deaf. And even when we started it, it was very case-to-case basis, very one-on-one basis. And now things are back into action. So I think that recognition of like what you need to do at the right time, the fact that communications folks know most about crisis communications more than anyone else, and there cannot be a bigger crisis that we all are facing at this point of time. So I think the nuances, the understanding, and the fact of getting people together, even when you're not together physically, helped in the storytelling bit. And I think like we have had, like I think the Ford team overall has done a great job in making things relevant for frontline workers and stepping up to the game. But that's more dealing with the real stuff, but also from a storytelling point of view and doing things remotely or virtually. I think there is a huge reliance on communications, and I think that's not going to stop anytime soon.
I guess it takes a pandemic for PR to get its due in the marketing mix. Nikhil, you were saying something?
If I look at it positively, it's actually, I would say COVID has in a way brought the creativity out of all of us, because, we've moved out of boardrooms, boardroom thinking, planning for 6 months, planning for 9 months. We realized that, the business in the world has changed. So it's made us, think while we are in the move. Every day there's a different story. Every country is in a different, earlier you could take the same story across different markets, but right now every market is in a different situation, the situations vary in every market. So what I realized is that, it's made, it's brought the creative juices out of all the brands, and also the purpose of, purpose around doing business has, the connect with the audience, the emotional connect that we have to build, that's also come out really well. Of course, business has changed. Like Bodhi was saying, Fitbit is completely, a part of our business is completely focused on how we can help people. We made production time dedicated to making ventilators. We've changed our product strategy so that, our products have features that help people during this pandemic. But what I what I really think is helped everyone is the fact that, people are thinking more real time, and people are thinking, strategies are being developed as every day we are looking at situation evolving. So that's made, that's challenged all of us, but I think that's been a good challenge to have for all the storytellers and all marketers. I would say every marketer is trying to look at innovative ways in terms of taking the brand to the audiences, and also internal audience, like internal employees, communication with internal employees, how it has changed. The fact that people have accepted, that there are challenges when people are working from home. There are challenges for somebody who's taking care of their kids, who's taking care of their work. You need to acknowledge that that is part of life. It's not working from home, I call it, you're living by work. So because everything is around your work right now when you're at home, while you're also trying to juggle and manage everything else. So in that case, I think that's how I would see the impact has really been on the businesses.
Perfect. So we're going to be jumping into some questions from the audience, but before we get there, I just want to have a one-line sum up from each of you. If you were to give advice to our audience as to how to take your career global, how can you think globally and get to where you are today? I'm sure a lot of them are aspiring to be where you are today. So that one piece of advice that you'd like to give. Anubha, can we start with you?
Sure. I think because again, I'm still learning, and it's been pretty new role for me. But I think one thing that worked for me is no matter where you are geographically, you have to start you have to have the mindset of thinking global, and you have to, in your own current role, see that how can you zoom out and look at what you're doing, how will it impact other regions, and as much as possible, because India is a great market and a lot of companies already have global roles based out of India. So I think being in India should not stop you from thinking global, and try and collaborate more with the global team and see how you can already get that experience while you're in India before even thinking of moving outside.
Great. Thank you. Lavanya, yourself.
I'll just kind of sum it up in 3 really short phrases. 1, please think about your personal brand. This is very important. Second, what's your sphere of influence, the individual sphere of influence, because this is very critical for you to know how you would influence people, whether it's informal or formal. And the third most important thing is, how do you navigate the right way? So if you want to grow in your career globally, you need to really find your way to navigate the corporate world. So those are 3 crisp things from me.
Crisp and summed up. Nice. Nikhil, yourself?
Yeah, so I think one of the points that I really believe, and Lavanya just touched upon it, is how are you building your own brand? And by that, I don't mean just go out and advertise yourself or do something on those lines, but just it's important for people to see the potential in you, and your eagerness to know more and be the one that they would recommend for a regional role. The other thing I would say is that, and that's, I think, really important, is that and advice that I got very early in my career was, you don't get promoted to a role. You're already ready for that role, and then you go into that. Promotion is basically a role that you're already ready for. So I think that's why it's very important for young people who want to go out that, start looking at opportunities where you can interact with people from different cultures, different regions, and different campaigns which are regional. You don't necessarily need to go out of India to be on a regional campaign. Like I got a perfect opportunity while I was working in India for Fitbit to work on a regional campaign, and that's what they looked at me and they gave me this opportunity. So that's really important, that look at those opportunities wherever you find them, and always go in with a clean slate. I think that's something that's always helped me. I came into PR without knowing anything about PR, so and that's always kept me fresh. And and whenever I think there are too many thoughts in my mind, I actually try and delete everything and say, okay, let's start fresh. Tomorrow's going to be a fresh day, a new day, and put some new thoughts in my mind, and always be positive about things, because your vibe attracts your tribe. So as long as you're positive, I think that's a very important thing. I always believe in how your mindset is, and that's really going to help you go further in your career. Yeah.
Wonderful. Vibe attracts your tribe. I really like that. Bodhi?
Like what they said. Dream big. Raise your hand at the right time, and listen to your mom.
Listen to your mom. That's the most important. Great. So I'm going to go into the questions now. So our first question is from Sabiana, and the question is for Lavanya. She wants to know, how do you sell your story to the media who don't speak or understand English, considering you don't speak Japanese?
Interesting question. First of all, when you don't speak the language, you do take along with you the person who speaks the language. This is very important. We always have interpreters that go with us. And after a certain period of time, you do get used to this person being your voice, and you stop actually recognizing their presence. I'm sorry for all the interpreters, but that is what happens. Two is, I don't think it's about the language, like I said at the beginning. It's about whether the story that you're pitching makes sense to that particular journalist. So it's very important to know what is the interest of the person, what are the areas that we are working on. But two is also, there is inside out and outside in perspective. Most of the time, comms people want to just go and pitch the story from their company's point of view, which never works for the media. You have to always think about, does that make sense for their audience? So these are basic principles. It doesn't matter which media you're talking to. If you actually are able to sell the story which works for them, they'll take it.
Okay, great. The next question, actually, any of you can choose to answer. It comes from Dheeraj, and he is asking that we are quite well-versed managing our local stakeholders' expectations, but how is it like to work with a team where you're dealing with global leaderships and peers? Any of you would like to take that up?
Yeah, I think I can take that on. So,
Sure.
When you're referring to, you're talking about local leadership, but when you're in a regional, local is again very subjective, right? Because you're dealing with the leadership in different markets, which is again the core for the business is still the same. So again, I think the simple way that it works is that we are experts in what our role is. We are communicators, we are storytellers. So as long as we are able to tell the story of the brand to our leadership teams or what the business stakeholders that we have and what our plan and strategy is, and be very clear about it and show them how it aligns to the business, I don't think it really matters which geography they are sitting in or which country they are in, because it's the same thing you're trying to just replicate in different geographies. And I think the point that everybody has made, the only thing that we have to be very aware of is, culture and how culturally different each of the market is. So, for example, I know that, as Lavanya was talking, my country manager in Japan, there's a different way that he understands things, and it would be different from how my country manager in China is. But at the end of the day, I'm trying to communicate the same thing, and I'm trying to communicate the same thoughts on how we're trying to, push our brand further in their market and help their business. So the principles remain the same. So I don't think that the principles really change. It's just being aware of, the personalities you're dealing with. So it's like client servicing. You're dealing with different clients every day. It's the same way you're dealing with your leadership.
Pretty much like that. Right. The next question comes from Neha, and she's quite specifically asking, so what do you think are the prerequisites for you to move geographies? If someone's looking at you for a global role, what do you think they're looking for?
I can just weigh in on that. I think it is. I would acknowledge that it's not the easiest when you're moving geographies, not only from India, but from any other country. To moving any geographies is not the easiest. But I think what has been said before, I think building the brand, and wherever you are working, you should choose the organization. If you really want to go outside of India, you will. Like, I'm not saying you do not start with a local firm, but you can, if that's your aspiration, you need to work at a global agency or at a global client and work and raise your hand at the right time that you have an aspiration, because more and more companies are open to having talent from across the globe, but they don't know. So you have to make your aspirations known well in advance. It can be 1 year in advance, 2 years in advance, it can be 5 years, but you have to have that known. And then in the second step is to make it very, very connected with the colleagues across the globe. Like, sometimes it's not that one leader that can take you there. It can be a colleague who is working in some other organization who knows of the opening. So that means I'm not talking about the highest rung leadership that always knows about things. my opportunity to Europe came from a colleague who I was working with, who gave me a call one day and said that, hey, this opportunity is opening up in London. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, why not? And then she connected me to our boss at that time. So sometimes it's those connections. Sometimes we forget that, oh, we just have to be pally with the leader, and it doesn't work that way. You have to make that connection at a personal level, not at an opportunistic way, but like generally be friends with people, help people, get people what they want. And who knows, something will work out very soon. So I would say those are the two that work for me.
Right. One very interesting question has come again from Sabiana, asking about how internal communications is different in other countries compared to India. And I'm sure you all have dealt with a bit of internal communications for your respective firms, but just quickly, if one of you could weigh in on this as to how you have found this to be different, specifically in comparison to India.
I wouldn't say it is different. Again, it's very audience centric, right? It's basically the differences would be the language and the tools that you use. And how do you communicate? Because there are very different ways of communicating. Some countries still believe in a personal communications. So they do want to see the executive, talk to the executive, have that conversation. Well, some countries are very comfortable with the digital way of doing it. I see that there is a tendency in some of the Asian countries to go heavy on video, top-down communications, which is the norm because the culture over there is always to look up to your top. So if you just have top-down communications, it's fine. But there are certain countries where horizontal two-way communications are very, very important because employees don't really get convinced by just top-down videos coming or messages coming from executives. There is an increasingly growing trend of bottom-up communications these days that you can see in many of the global companies because people want to listen to the voice of the employees and especially the millennials because they are shaping the way we communicate every day and their way of receiving messages is completely different and they do have the courage to question, which wasn't the case with earlier generations. So I think it's so much linked to not just about where you're working or what country it is. It's more about the psychographics of people and the layers. And this was a conversation I was having just today. It's about the layers that you create within the organization, which will define different tools to communicate, whether it's the millennials or the middle management or the executives. It all depends on how you address your audience.
Wonderful. So I think on that note, we've had a very, very nice session, hearing some wonderful things from all of you. So thank you so much for your time and for your insights. I think everyone who has been watching has really appreciated this session, including myself. So thanks again, and Anubhuti, on to you.
Thank you, Neha, for this fabulous discussion. I'm sure our listeners are going away with a lot of learnings today. I would like to thank our panelists, Anubha, who joined us from London, Bodhi, who is currently at Detroit, Lavanya, who joined us from Japan, and Nikhil, who is currently located in Singapore. Thank you to all our attendees for taking the time out this evening. I would also like to thank our partner, WordsWork Communications, and Ravi Prakash from Bottom Line Language Solutions for supporting this special edition. We will be back next Wednesday with another edition of Prime Time with a focus on regional communications. This week on Friday, join us for the next edition of the Communicators Assembly Point, where we will speak with heads from educational institutes on the future of PR education. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram at RepTodayMag for updates and registration links of all our upcoming offerings. See you soon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.